In episode 110, the second to last episode of the magnum opus of galactic sci-fi anime,
銀河英雄伝説
or the legend of the Galactic Heroes, Minister of Military Affairs and personal advisor to the Kaiser himself, Officer Paul von Oberstein dies a tragic death in the Kaiser's temporary residence. In order to protect the Kaiser, he had lured out a terrorist group to kill the Kaiser. He had given them information of the Kaiser's whereabouts, but falsified the key information about exactly which room the Kaiser was guarded at. Or so it seems, since the terrorist, after successfully getting past security and throwing an explosive device into Oberstein's room, yes, Oberstein's room and not the Kaiser's room, they fled the scene in firm belief that the Kaiser had been the victim of the attack. Oberstein suffered fatal injuries to his body and died quickly of what seemed like bloodlust while rejecting any medical help for the sake of his dignity. According to the series, it was debated whether Oberstein's death was a mistake on his part or a heroic suicide to save the Kaiser, and indeed the question arises if any of these options really satisfy his death. To start to understand the case better, we should start by looking at Oberstein's character. While I have very little knowledge about personal psychology and the methods of categorizing one's character traits, there are some things that we can conduct on the surface that could help. The things that interest me take shape of more philosophical character, namely moral value traits. The series do not have morally oversimplified characters that are either purely vicious or virtuous. This is one of the series' strong points when it comes to character building, at least, because it makes it more anchored in our real-life experiences of moral character of real people around us. Oberstein is often portrayed as a vicious character, but I'll get to why this is an oversimplification. Can Oberstein be said to be a virtuous character then? By all means, he seems to be loyal to his death, and despite having Machiavellian characteristics of planning and cunning, he never seemed to betray the actors he is loyal to. His loyalty to the Kaiser and the Empire never seems to falter even for a second. In that regard, it could be argued that he possesses strong virtuous characteristics. However, Oberstein clearly lacks other moral virtues such as empathy and compassion. Oberstein is void of ideological motives and is clearly the series' staple pragmatist. He is highly materialistic, and his decision-making is in fact so objective and logically sound that it makes him seem uncannily dehumanized. With these robot-like autistic traits in mind, the case can also be made that he lacks some virtues. Despite this dichotomy, he clearly leans towards being more virtuous according to the series. A good indicator for this is that seemingly all virtuous characters in Ginga always follow their character traits. I will explain. In Ginga, characters follow their set character traits very carefully and only deviate from them in case of psychological breakdown or if an obfuscated, deceitful character trait arises from the shadows for some reason. An exemption could be argued that Freudenthal deviated from his character while keeping his virtuosity intact in the end of the series, but this is kind of a topic for another time. Neither of these seem to be the case for Oberstein, since he follows his personal traits until his last breath. Well, it seems like it will get back to this, but this principle of trait following is explicitly displayed as a virtue in a case between Bittenfeld and the Kaiser, despite these traits clearly being flawed in that instance. And that is exactly why this is relevant for Oberstein's case. I'll explain. Bittenfeld's flawed traits were rooted in his overconfident aggressiveness. Negative effects of such character traits are, however, forgiven in this instance, given that he simply followed them. Bittenfeld foolishly aggressed beyond the point of safety into enemy lines, and needlessly lost many lives of his fleet, and almost did not make it out at all as an effect of his actions. It was a devastating mistake and worthy of a great punishment from an authoritarian leader and genius such as the Kaiser. It was to be expected. But the Kaiser forgave his commander's action fully, as the man had only acted according to his character and as such could not be ultimately blamed for his actions. Here it seems as though the preservance of the purity in one's actions, that is, to what degree they are purely motivated by one's own character traits, is regarded very highly. The reason for this being regarded as a virtue in itself is very interesting, but again, perhaps a topic for another time. As a side note, this is somewhat of the ultimate degrading punishment for Bittenfeld. The Kaiser does, after all, choose to forgive him, seemingly because Bittenfeld had virtuously and purely followed his own character trait that simply led him to a foolish action. And just like a parent would do with a child, thus the Kaiser pitifully relieves Bittenfeld of all the responsibility of his very own actions. To return to the topic at hand, character traits are to be followed if one wants to be seen as virtuous in the series. It's seemingly one of the core morals of all good characters in Ginga. Only bad characters falter at these things, and it usually brings about their end in the series. Oberstein can thus be said, despite his questionable judgment, lack of empathy, and despite being frowned upon by almost all of Kaiser's associates, to be a virtuous character. And as such, he follows his character traits vice versa. With this, we have concluded that Oberstein did indeed not make any decisions that would go against his character traits, as he took his final decisions. Then what would a character like Oberstein do? The question should rather be what he would not do. As an important cog in the ever more halting machinery of the Empire, he of all people would have realized his importance to its survival. After all, a purely logical and pragmatically motivated person amidst a sea of more or less emotionally motivated people should come to the conclusion that they themselves would be an unreplaceable piece in keeping order in this machine. Oberstein, being the pragmatist that he was, should then have done everything in his power to prevent his own death, not because of narcissism, as it might have appeared to the others if he had held his own life of higher value than others, but because of purely logical reasoning and necessity for the better of the Empire. As such, it would seem to go against the very same logic that Oberstein takes as second nature, and that is embedded in his character, to not take all the precautions he could to prevent the death of a cog named Oberstein, who in this instance just happens to be himself. So, did he take all the precautions he could to prevent his own death? That is the question. The problem is that he himself leaked information to the terrorists, and as such, he chose his own room to be a target of the assassination attempt. He could practically dictate the date and place and time he wanted the attack to take place, and he would have most likely known that the terrorists would use explosives just like they had done many times before in other attacks throughout Heinesen, the region under his command. Oberstein's character simply does not allow him to make such a logical contradiction. What happened to him was obviously planned, and easily avoidable if he wanted to. But why would Oberstein do this? Did we not just say that he should have logically valued his own life above all? Well, not above all, of course. The Kaiser's life would still be the most valuable asset to the Empire. Logically, the Empire lives and dies by the Kaiser. As such, the Kaiser's life would be in danger. Even Oberstein's life would be worth sacrificing to protect it. This would be all according to Oberstein's character, since a cold-blooded pragmatist such as himself would not even flinch in the eyes of death, if it made logical sense to die. Naturally, this allows Oberstein to still be virtuous while sacrificing his own life. It makes sense. Problems arise, however, when we assess Oberstein's options. Even though it might make sense theoretically, a brief empirical overview brings a lot of questions. Why did he not just call in more guards and catch the terrorists? in front of the building or something, some sort of ambush before they could even get to Ibrahim or the Kaiser. After all, a master of planning and cunning, as Oberstein was, one would expect him to catch these terrorists with ease. He had almost all information he needed to put up a perfect trap for them. Despite this, the Kaiser's residence was appallingly guarded, and if it were not for our rebellion main character's antics, the terrorist leader would have even escaped the premises of the assassination attempt. It almost seems as though he willingly let down his guard to lead the terrorists in further. It does seem to go against logic, but perhaps this was the only way he could be assured that the terrorists would get caught. Maybe too much preparations would have scared the terrorists away. It is also worth taking into account that Oberstein specifically did not trust others, and as such he would probably only trust a few select personal guards. He would be too paranoid to increase the guard defenses with untested manpower. And sometimes it also has to be reminded that Oberstein is a human character after all, and despite his sense for making purely objective and logically sound decisions, perfection is not achievable for a human. Perhaps Oberstein really thought that this was the only sure way to protect the Kaiser, and thus he had to put his own life at risk for doing so.